I hope everyone is doing really well. Welcome. Today I brought Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein, which is a poetry collection. Normally, I divide my videos into two sections, the first section without any spoilers, and the second section with spoilers. But since this is a collection of 135 poems, and there's not really something I can spoil, I'm going to start by giving some context and general information about this book, and then I'll move on to some of my favorite poems from this collection. The poet of this book is the renowned author Shel Silverstein, who is best known for writing The Giving Tree. And if that title doesn't ring any bells, The Giving Tree is about a boy who takes everything he can from a tree throughout his life, and a tree that keeps on giving until it has nothing left. I was not surprised when I found out that Where the Sidewalk Ends and The Giving Tree were written by the same person because both books had a very deep message that was told in a short and accessible way for even children to understand fully. If you aren't really a poetry type of person, and if you haven't read lots of poetry before, which was exactly where I was before reading this one, this is the perfect first step into poetry. It's got deep themes that are reflected in the most straightforward and clear language possible. Oftentimes, many of the famous poems are written in ways that make you reread it to completely get its message. But as this is a children's poetry collection, it's super easy to understand and is also a book that made my affinity for poetry quadruple. One thing I really loved about this book was how all the 135 poems were different from each other. One of these differences is the length. If you look at the poem called Fish, on page 145, you'll see a super short poem with only 4 lines. But if you go to pages 160 to 161, you'll see the poem Hungry Mungry, which is a 2-page long story-like poem. Having this mixture and balance of different lengths made the book more interesting to go through. Because I feel that even though readers know all the poems are different lengths really emphasize the diversity and make you feel more engaged. Like, you're not just reading the same kind of stuff over and over again. It's still poetry, but it's really different. And it can be dull for some to read multiple poems in one sitting, which is what will happen since poems don't really take that long to read. And having different lengths and structures just alleviates that problem to a huge extent. Another thing I really loved about this book was the illustrations. Silverstein illustrated and wrote all the poems himself. The illustrations had a different effect depending on which poem it was from. Some helped explain chaotic meanings, while others added to the humor and entertainment. Take the poem What's in the Sack on page 111 as an example. The picture of a humongous sack really emphasized how big it was and made me want to know what was in it while I was reading. Sure, the poem uses phrases like it has the world's most enormous balloon or the biggest old meatball to emphasize the sack's big size, but the illustration really adds to the reader's imagination and curiosity by visually presenting the sack's size. Before introducing some of my favorite poems from this collection, I just want to say that apparently this book used to be banned in some schools. I was totally not aware of this until I got into like 3/4 of the book. It was very interesting because I can't think off the top of my head how many previously banned books I've read before, at least not that I know of. Apparently, it was banned in some schools because it included disrespect for authority, violence, and references to harmful actions in some of the poems. Now, since you know more about this book in general, I'd like to go over some of my favorite poems here. First of all, my absolute favorite was Shadow Wash on page 113. It's about a person who realizes that he or she's never washed their own shadow before. Realizing how filthy and unsanitary that is, the speaker decides to peel their own shadow off the wall and put it in the wash tub with like soap, bleach, etc. In the end, the shadow shrinks from the washing. I love this poem because it's so creative. Like, to begin with, the idea of washing your own shadow because it must be dirty from never having received any washing. That was utterly brilliant. I loved the ending as well, with the shadow shrinking after the washing. I know that clothes shrink when you put them in the drying machine. I think clothes do shrink in the wash tub if you put hot water in it and stuff. But either way, the whole idea of this poem was just hilarious and so creative that it made me laugh so hard. Moving on to the poem Fish, on page 145, which I mentioned earlier as an example of a short poem. Fish. The little fish eats the tiny fish. The big fish eats the little fish. So only the biggest fish get fat. Do you know any folks like that? This poem is the perfect example of how poetry is the instrument to delivering big ideas and inspirations in like the tiny amount of words. This poem was only like 4 lines in total, but the message that it conveyed was incomparably humongous compared to its length. The poem Alice on page 112 was also very thought-provoking. Alice. She drank from a bottle called Drink Me, and she grew up so tall. She ate from a plate called Taste Me, and down she shrank so small. And so she changed, while other folks tried nothing at all. Wow. In case you didn't know, this reference to Alice is from Alice in Wonderland, and in that book, Alice drinks from different bottles that make her shrink or grow taller. I agree wholeheartedly with this poem because sometimes risks and personal sacrifices are good in the long run. Trying new things and embracing changes are the only way to improve your character or situation. Sure, it may do the opposite of what you intended, but you'll never know, and not doing anything won't make any of the good stuff happen. Although when I say this, I'm not advocating for people to drink from suspicious and unrecognized bottles like Alice, because that can be very lethal. But you get the point. The final poem I'll be addressing is Pirate Captain Jim on page 144, which is a relatively lighter poem. I just really liked this one because I loved how it was composed only of dialogues. It really just felt like a witty story, and the illustrations completed the final touch to making it a humorous masterpiece. Now, these are just a few of the poems that adhered to my taste, but even if the ones I mentioned weren't really your cup of tea, I'm confident that if you're the type of person that appreciates witty and creative poems that make you feel young again, you'll find many poems in this book to be very interesting. I hope you enjoyed this video and the poems here. I really had so much fun going over this book, as it really is the poetry collection that opened my eyes to poetry. Have a great read, everyone.